Well, Steve, we're starting the book of Exodus today, and it's always exciting starting a new book. And there's a lot of interesting things in Exodus, a lot of things that we can apply in our lives today, plus learn a whole lot of things about God.
Yes.
And so what are your thoughts just going into Exodus? Brand new book for us here.
Well, Exodus is key to the scriptures in general. It's key to the story of the nation of Israel. A lot of things happen in Exodus. We talked about that during our overview, but it's where the law is given. It's where God takes the people out of the bondage and slavery and through miraculous ways. It's where the Passover is first given. And so there's a lot of different things that are in Scripture, both from a symbolic and from a parallel and from types as well, that happen in the book of Exodus, as do with other books of the Bible as well.
And the New Testament tells us that studying the Old Testament is valuable. I mean, we're commanded. 1 Corinthians 10:11 says that the things that happened to Israel in the Old Testament are examples and warnings to us here in the church age. And so and there's people like Stephen and Peter and Paul that are always quoting these things and assume their audience know these things from the Old Testament. And so those are all really valuable things for us to know. And the way I like to think of it is the New Testament has these really strong, pithy statements of theology and things that sometimes even one little sentence can be so strong that it takes us a while to kind of digest that and unpack it. Whereas the Old Testament has these long, very easy to understand stories that just go down really easy. And you can apply that, and the application is just so easy to understand. So many of the same truths from the New Testament are taught in the Old Testament. It's just done in a way that's a lot easier to understand.
And we're saying Old Testament and New Testament from a Christian perspective, but the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible. And whenever it's talked about in the New Testament about the scriptures being quoted or things like that, this is it. This is the Hebrew Bible, this area of what we call the Old Testament. That's what the Hebrew Bible is.
And one thing to mention, Steve, I guess we probably should have mentioned this in our overview. There are many people teach something that I don't necessarily agree with, which is they'll say that you can't really understand the Old Testament except through the lens of the New Testament. That you read these people would say you read the New Testament and then use that to interpret the Old Testament. And I would disagree and mainly say it like this. Yes, sure, there's things that just come out and make the Old Testament richer once we understand the New Testament. For example, what we're going to get into here in the book of Exodus is Moses. And Moses is a type of Jesus Christ. And if all you had was Exodus, you really wouldn't have the fuller application and implications of Moses' life being compared to Jesus' life and what Moses did compared to what Jesus did. But that said, it's not the case that we can't understand Exodus unless we understand what goes on in the New Testament that would then reinterpret the Old Testament. No. Whatever the Old Testament means, it means what it meant to the people at the time in that context. And that meaning doesn't change. So the context of what Moses or Isaiah or Ezekiel or anything else happening in the Old Testament, whatever it meant to them at the time still means now. And the New Testament doesn't change that. Yes, there's some fuller, richer, double applications and things like that we can have based on the New Testament. But it's not the case that the meaning changed from the ancient Israel to today after Christ. No, whatever it meant to them, it means today. It's just with the New Testament, we can see a more fuller, richer implication and application.
Yeah, and that's part of what we do when we reason through the scriptures, reason through the Bible, is that we will use what's commonly referred to as the 5 W's and the H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who is it being written to? Where is it taking place? Why was it written? Things like that. And so we always want to keep in the context of what you mentioned, Glenn, in regards to being able to really understand what's going on and how it applies to the New Testament, and also that overarching storyline that has to do with the Bible in general.
Right. So let's go ahead and dive in to the book of Exodus. We have here in Exodus chapter 1, we have it becomes very clear that the first of Exodus is really a continuation of the end of Genesis. So if you were to read Genesis, it just flows right through into Exodus. And the first word in Hebrew is not actually brought out in most of the English translations. The first word is and. Yeah. And then this happened. And so many of the English translations translate it now this happened. But it really is a continuation. And it jumps right in and starts, for example, in verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And it reads off all of these names of these tribes, right? And I'm not going to read all of them, but it's got 11 names here, and then it explains at the end of verse 5 that Joseph was already in Egypt. Now we can learn a few things from that. First of all, these are the 12 tribes. When it says sons of Israel, then these are the sons of the man Israel.
Right.
And Steve, this always is something I always have to make a point out of. Sometimes in the Bible, when it says Israel, it's talking about the country or the nation of Israel. And sometimes when it mentions Israel, it's talking about this one man whose name was Israel that started out as Jacob. Right? And
Correct.
So which one's here?
This is talking about Jacob himself, the man Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And then here in verse 7, we'll see it's talking about the nation of Israel.
Right. And so that's what we have here. So it talks in the first several verses here. It lists off these names of these sons of the man Israel who became these are the 12 tribes, right? And so it's a few things we can pull out of this. First of all, the names, how are they listed here, Steve? What's the order that it includes? It's not the order of how that they were born, right? This is the order of what?
They're listed by the order of their wives.
The wives of Jacob.
Of Jacob, correct.
Right. So this was the order of how they were born according to the wife. Remember, Jacob / Israel, this one man, he had children with more than one woman. And in fact, I think there was 4 of them, if I remember right.
Right.
There was Leah and Rachel, and then there was 2 maids.
Right.
And so the order here in chapter 1 of Exodus is according to the wife. Now, what does this tell me? This tells me that the author of this, and we believe it's Moses, had a very intimate knowledge of the history of Israel. This wasn't done by somebody who didn't really know the background of Israel. So there are clues in the book of Exodus that has both a heavy root in the history of the Jewish people and also a heavy root in the Jewish people being in Egypt rather, because there's a lot of Egyptian history in here as well that we'll bring out as we go.
And so we see that through listing of the wives, we see that chiastic structure that you've talked about so many times in our other book studies of a 4-3-4. And then, of course, Joseph is listed separately as being filling out the 12 tribes that are there. So part of this, sometimes it's speculated that, of course, the chiastic structure is so that memorization, again, you've talked about that, but it's also could be to the fact that, hey, not one tribe was specifically above another tribe in relation to it, because many times in genealogy, they'll list maybe the oldest to the youngest. But in this case, we have it listed by the wives.
And so to bring that out again, it's got here in verse 1, the names of the sons of Israel. But then in verse 5, all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob. Same person.
Right.
That it's talking about there.
Correct.
Right? And so it talks about him being 70 because Joseph was already in Egypt. And so what's interesting to me is if we look at verse 7, Verse 7 says, "But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Now, a couple of things we learn from there, Steve. First of all, the language here reflects the same list of verbs and the same actions here that God gave Adam back in the Garden of Eden. When it says there that these people were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, that's language right out of Garden of Eden.
Right.
Because that was what God had commanded. What did he command Adam and Eve to do?
To be fruitful and multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply. Yeah. And that language right back in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 is the same verbs, same Hebrew verbs listed here. So there's obviously a parallel going on there between, again, he commanded Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. What did he tell was going to happen to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant?
He was going to be the head of a great nation.
Right. So right here is the fulfillment of that. Mm-hmm. So not only do we have this obvious parallel to both Garden of Eden and the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis, but we also have the fulfillment of that. I mean, this is hundreds of years down the line, and so we have those things literally fulfilled.
Yeah, and we also see here, so as we're going to find out, they go into bondage here with the Egyptian leadership, but for sure, under these circumstances, they have been able to flourish. They've been under the protection here in Egypt for so long, whereas if they would have been just in the land of Canaan itself, they possibly could have been wiped out. Now, of course, God gave the promise and that wouldn't have happened, but you can see what I'm talking about in that here they're in Egypt, and through this 400 years that they are there, they have flourished and multiplied. And as they're going to come out, just as God told Abraham, they're going to come out a greater people, a greater nation. And that's what we're going to see in this book.
So here's a question for you, Steve. Back in Genesis chapter 12, God promised Abraham that your descendants are going to be numerous. Mm-hmm. He repeated it again several times, specifically Genesis 22:17. Mm-hmm. You're going to be numerous. And in Abraham's lifetime, he didn't see that.
No.
And this is, as you just said, by the time we get here to Exodus chapter 1, it's over 400 years later. Is God slow to keep his promise? Did he forget?
No, he didn't. And again, he actually told Abraham that this was going to happen. And, to again further clarify to Abraham, you're going to be a great nation, but first, your descendants are going to go into captivity for a period of 400 years. So God, I do think it is key that God told Abraham that it was going to happen, because again, this story is being told to these people. It was told to Isaac, it was told to Jacob. And so while they're here in Egypt and while they're growing and flourishing, the oral stories and the oral tradition and the things are being passed along to the people, and they have the knowledge of what the promises are given to Abraham and everything else, even as they're here in Egypt. We just have the transcript here, and we believe that Moses wrote it, but it was passed down from generation to generation orally. So
what I get out of this is these first 7 verses of Exodus, they're drawing a parallel to Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. He's drawing a parallel to Abrahamic covenant. He's drawing this parallel to what he promised to Jacob. Mm-hmm. And so God is always faithful. God keeps his promise. He keeps his promise. He works on his own schedule, but he will work. And so sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes God's movements are slower than what we recognize. But I submit to you, he does not forget, and he keeps his promises. And we can be confident that what he promised to us will be fulfilled, simply because what he promised to Abraham and what he promised to Jacob are fulfilled as well.
That's right.
So, Steve, let's read the next section, starting at verse 8 and going down to 14. Can we read that here in Exodus 1?
Yeah, it says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight us against us and depart from the land.' So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them."
Okay, so it says in verse 8, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, this is what happens, just sort of a normal passage of time. Generations come and generations go.
Yeah.
And people forget, and values change over time. Israel was in Egypt over 400 years. And so this new Pharaoh comes along. It likely wasn't, what it's talking about here, it likely wasn't the very next one. Because again, they were there for 400
Right,
years. So
yeah.
many generations down the line, over
Right.
430 years, there arose a Pharaoh that didn't really remember Joseph and things like that.
And how often does it happen in the history of a nation itself that over those hundreds of years in any nation, they will forget the forefathers or the people that began the nation or the things that change. It's kind of a tendency to do that unless there's a very purposeful thing in order to pass information down about them from generation to generation.
So we've seen in our day, people forget. The founding fathers of our country, people have forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's a question, Steve. How long has it been since Abraham? And one, the Jewish people are still a group.
Right.
They're still an ethnic group.
Right.
And they still remember. They still remember the things all the way back to Abraham.
Yeah.
And all the way back to Moses. And here we are in 400 years, the leaders of Egypt forgot about Joseph. Well, the Jewish people didn't forget. And the mere fact that we still have Jewish people as a nation when they had been dispersed multiple times out of the land for many centuries, but they still have their own ethnic identity.
Yeah.
I just find that amazing that they haven't forgotten.
Right. And it's miraculous in and of itself, I believe.
Now, so in verse 10, what was Pharaoh worried about in verse 10?
They were growing to the point and to the extent that they became a danger, possibly like through an uprising or something else like that. Their number had become more than what the Egyptian people or the Egyptian military would be able to handle. So all of a sudden, which is typical with kings and people in power, they start getting paranoid of an uprising, something that might happen that would depose them and take away their power from them.
Right. If they're worried about if there's a war, then these people might join the enemy, and they're already inside our nation. So they're worried about an uprising and losing a battle. So then in verse 11, what did they do? What was the command in verse 11?
For them to put taskmasters over and put them to hard labor.
Hard labor.
Yeah.
This is turning them into slaves.
Correct.
Right here is when they go from, okay, they're just a people that live here, into where they ultimately become slaves.
Right.
And so a lot of the slavery in Egypt language that we hear about for the rest of the Old Testament, it starts right here.
Mm-hmm.
And so it even, what does it say there? Hard labor.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not just labor. Now it's hard labor.
Right.
And so one note here, it's going to get worse. here in just a minute.
Yeah.
But the Egyptians put hard labor. In a minute, it's going to use the word rigor.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing to note is that later, once we get to God's law, God puts restrictions on that. Anybody working for you or anybody in a slave or indentured servant arrangement, you can't treat them like that, God says. So God had a system of ethics where you will not treat people like Egypt treated you. And so that's one of the lessons here, that it permeates throughout the whole rest of the Old Testament. And so then in verse 11, the Egyptians afflicted Israel with burdens of hard labor. The word here is in 11 is the same word, these burdens. What I find this is interesting. They afflicted Israel with burdens, hard labor. Over in Isaiah 53, which is the messianic passage, chapter, that it foreshadows Jesus. It says there that the Messiah has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Mm-hmm. It's the same word. So over here in Exodus 1, Egypt put all these heavy burdens on you. Over in Isaiah 53, the Messiah carried our burdens.
Yeah.
And so I find that interesting, is that the burdens put on by Pharaoh in Egypt, which is the symbol of the world, symbol of a worldly oppression or satanic oppression, Jesus bore that. Jesus took that from us. I just find that interesting. And in verse 11, it also says that the Egyptian forced Israel to help build cities. And it specifically mentions the names of two of these cities. Mm-hmm. Now, one of these cities was named Ramses, which was named after one of the pharaohs. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily mean it was at the same time. There was more than one Ramses. And it could have been like United States, we name a city after Washington long after the man Washington had died.
Right.
And so Egypt, in this sense, represents ungodliness. Egypt represents ungodliness. And the ungodly always focus on themselves and naming things after themselves and their own glory. What do godly people do? We don't name things after ourselves. The godly people, what do we name things after?
We point to God.
We point to the Lord.
We want to glorify God.
Now, what do we know? These cities were probably in and around the Nile, right, Steve? What do we know about, just because it makes some context here. We need to know a little bit about the geography in Egypt with the Nile River.
Well, both of these cities, through our archaeological finds, are in what's an area called Goshen, and we're told later in Exodus as well that the Israelites were in this area called Goshen, the land of Goshen, which was in the northeastern part of Egypt there. So it was east of the Nile and in the kind of northern part, east of that delta part.
Right. So it says here in verse 11, so they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, and it mentions two of them, Pithom and Ramses. And so what we find here is that they were building things for the Egyptians, the Israelites were. And of course, most people think in Egypt, we think of pyramids or the Sphinx or the Egyptian temples, but those were made out of cut stone. And what he's talking about here were the cities, not the temples or the monuments. The cities were, there's a lot of people lived there, so had to be made out of bricks.
Right.
And so they forced the Jewish people to build bricks.
Right.
And these were baked bricks, so you had to gather the mud and mix straw with them and form them into molds and bake them. And so it was a lot of work because they had a huge construction projects.
And it's backbreaking work too, because everything of the bricks laid out, it's on the ground. So they don't have elevated platforms. They take these bricks, they pack them into molds, and then they take the mold off, but they're bending over the whole time. They're sitting down or kneeling down or sitting down the whole time. It's literally back-breaking work.
And so we mention all this because this aligns very well, Exodus 1 aligns very well with what we know about the ancient geography of Egypt. It's because it aligns perfectly with what we know. The Nile was the source of life, because apart from the water from the Nile, it's a very dry country. Nothing will grow hardly. You can't farm or grow food there. There's no animals to eat off of. So they had to grow things in and around the Nile, and the Nile would flood every year. And so the whole book of Exodus reflects a knowledge of the Egyptian geography and the Egyptian history. Now, in verse 12, it says, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Now, this is true for Christianity as well. When Christians have hardship, what happens to the church?
It flourished, and we saw that when we went through Acts. The persecution brought about a greater expansion of the church.
What happens in the church when we don't get persecution, but we get wealthy and we get comfortable and things like that? What's happened over the course of church history when Christians have gotten sort of fat, dumb, and happy, and we get comfortable? What ends up happening? We get theologically and spiritually sick. Because the churches aren't healthy. Let some persecution come along, and what happens? The persecution happens in church history. We have a healthy church. Now, the numbers might be quite as big. Sometimes the numbers increase, but the numbers that are there under persecution are much more healthy church than in times of prosper. And so that's what we find here in verse 12. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And so some of us could use, this is going to sound bad, but we could use a little more persecution and we get a little more spiritually healthy. Because I can tell you, there are some weak, sick, theologically weak people out there that just don't have good spiritual muscles. Verse 13, the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. And the word here for rigorous, it was also used by God in a command for Israel not to treat their indentured servants in the manner. It mentions that in Leviticus 25:43. It says, do not make them work with rigor. Now, so then, by verse 14, Egypt is forcing cruel labor on all the Jewish people. Now, you remember what God told Abraham. What did he say? I will bless those who bless you, and I will what?
Curse those who curse you.
Now, every nation, I submit to you, Steve, every nation that has cursed Israel, cursed the Jewish people throughout history, has ended up having a bad end. End up being in destruction. Pharaoh in Egypt that tried to wipe out because that's what he's going to try to do here. He's going to try to kill all of the Jewish people. He ended up coming to a bad end. Hitler tried it in World War II. Every nation that has tried to persecute the Jews out of existence has ended up being destroyed themselves. There's even a joke amongst some Jewish people is that a lot of their holidays and festivals commemorate victory over these people that are trying to kill them. And so a Jewish person can rightfully look in the eye of someone that's trying to persecute them and say, I wonder what holiday we're going to name after you. And so that's what we find here is that all of these promises made way back in Genesis and Exodus, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And I submit to you, my friend, you curse a Jewish person to your own peril. Because God's promises are in concrete, and He will not forget. Now, we have here in the book of Exodus, we have this power struggle between the true God Yahweh proving His superiority and these pagan gods of Israel, or the pagan things. And it's really not a struggle, really. It's more of the true God Yahweh demonstrating His superiority, and Moses proving his superiority over Pharaoh. There's this theme there. God establishes this true worship compared to the false worship in Egypt, right? Don't you
Right.
don't you find that, Steve?
Yes, absolutely. And so that's a key thing. With the gods that the pagan nations worship, the Gentile nations worship, they had specific gods for each individual area. So they were a plurality of gods that they worshiped. And here we have Israel and Yahweh. Their God is one God. He's the God that has created everything. So that's another area of duality that we see regarding here. The one God, the creator God, the most high God, showing who he is for all these other gods that these Egyptians are worshiping.
And so this is true history. This happened. It's not a religious storybook. Mm-hmm. But what is here is not only true history, as we mentioned earlier, but there's these parallels and these types, and it plays throughout a spiritual application as well. For example, Pharaoh commanded the Jews in a little bit. The next passage we're going to read here. Pharaoh commanded the Jews to be cast into the river and drown. Mm-hmm. What happens later to Pharaoh? He's the one that ends up drowning in the river.
Right.
Right. And another one is that there's some of the Egyptian gods in the Egyptian myths came out of the river and then went on to become leader of the country. Mm-hmm. Well, where does Moses come from? Out of the river.
Yeah.
Right. And so another one, there's what ends up happening. He commands here in a few verses Pharaoh commands, throw all the Jewish male babies into the river. Mm-hmm. Well, what did they do? They did throw Moses in the river. Right. They just put him in a basket.
Right.
And so then Moses ends up coming out of the river and living in Pharaoh's household. Mm-hmm. And so there's all these parallels going on with spiritual truth. And so, Steve, that's probably a good spot here before we get into this next section to kind of wrap up for today. But any last things about what we had?
No, I'm just excited to start this book, and I'm looking forward to going through it. It's just going to be a good thing.
And there's just so much here that's so good. And this is what we do when we here on Reasoning Through the Bible. We look at these passages and try to dive in a little deeper and bring out some of the meanings. So we trust that you'll have your Bibles and follow along with us as we reason through the Bible.
Thanks for watching and listening. God bless you.